Jarrett, Chapter 13, Part 3 of our vocabulary terms. Hopefully this will be the last one. And so let us begin with John Foster Dulles. Dulles was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He was a devoted anti-communist. Keep in mind, Eisenhower was president during the 1950s, and there was a strong anti-communist movement in the 1950s. It talked about Joseph McCarthy, even though he was the wrong messenger, the message that there were communist spies in America was true. We have already talked about the rise of communist spying with the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, on and on and on. So, anyway, Dulles was a devoted anti-communist. He sought to contain, again, this term, contain the spread of communism. Containment was our policy under Truman and Eisenhower. We were seeking to contain communism by preventing the Soviets from gaining additional influence. So, instead of defeating communism, we wanted to contain it, keep it where it was, stop the spread of communism, and by stopping the spread of communism, of course, we would prevent the Soviets from gaining additional influence. And again, the biggest threat in the 1950s was Soviet communism. Now, Soviet communism is a little bit different than Chinese communism. The two are as much friends as they are rivals. And the Soviets were much more of a threat at this time than the Chinese were, primarily because the Soviets had nuclear weapons and the Chinese didn't at that time. So again, we wanted to stop the spread of Soviet communism because we felt that was the biggest problem we faced in the world. The Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine is an extension of containment that was started under President Truman. Eisenhower announced he would send U.S. troops. Now again, here is a key change. He would send U.S. troops to any Middle Eastern nation that requested help in defending itself against communism. And it wasn't just the Middle Eastern nations. He would send U.S. troops, this is the key part right here, he would send U.S. forces, U.S. troops, to help any nation that requested help in fighting against communism. This is a step up from Truman's doctrine, in which we would help financially in other ways stop the spread of communism. But Eisenhower is suggesting that we would use military might to help a country protect itself from communism. The Interstate Highway Act, 1956, created a system of federal highways. Part of this was due to the ever-growing population of America, and the expansion of Americans across the country. Part of it was due to the threat of, you guessed it, the threat of communism and the likelihood of nuclear war. With having an interstate highway system, people then could flee cities in case there was a threat of nuclear war. So one reason the Interstate Highway Act was created was to provide an avenue of escape in case of nuclear attack. The second one was to join cities and states so commerce could travel back and forth more easily. Let's go to our last bullet, baby boom, children born between the years of 1945 and 1963. I and my 4 siblings are all baby boomers. So if you were a child born between 1945 and 1963, you are a baby boomer. Now, those who were born in 1945, we're looking at them today are going to be in their early 60s. And as those individuals start to retire, okay, as those people start to retire, then, if I said early 60s, I apologize. Early 70s, I'm sorry. I made a math mistake there, I apologize. I didn't have my calculator with me. Anyway, so if you were born in 1945, you are in your early 70s, and you have already started to retire. That grew from about 45 through 50. I was born in 1958. I'm a few years away from retirement now, a few years away from retirement to get Social Security, but again, I am qualified to retire from teaching at any time I want. I'm about 6 to 7 years away from receiving Social Security benefits. So as The 1945 children born in 1945 started retiring about 4 or 5 years ago, and as they continue, that group, the baby boomers, continue to retire, we're going to see a huge strain placed upon Social Security. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. The GI Bill. There are a number of teachers on this campus who have taken advantage of this. We have a number of teachers who served within the military. The GI Bill officially is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. It helped veterans go to college and obtain housing. And so if you were a veteran of American military, then you could get loans, low-interest loans. You could get money to help you go to college to, again, move on from the military to a more successful civilian life. So again, we have a number of people on campus I'm aware of who have done this. And again, there are millions upon millions of American vets who have done this as well. So the GI Bill is a great piece of legislation. It is a way in which we as a nation help repay those men and women who have served their nation. Repay them by helping them transition from military service to successful civilian service. Our next one, Jonas Salk, and we're taking a little bit of a different turn here from the GI Bill to Jonas Salk, developed the first vaccine for polio. Keep in mind, polio was the disease that afflicted FDR relatively late in life. Polio usually strikes the youth of America. Well, used to, no longer does. But if you were to get polio, it would be probably when you were relatively young. FDR got it when he was older, and he suffered from it for the rest of his life. Again, polio is a disease of the muscles. It attacks the muscles, and eventually you lose the control of your limbs, your legs, your arms. And FDR really lost pretty much all the strength in his legs. He couldn't stand without the help of either leg braces or something to lean on, or crutches, or a cane. Streptomycin, an antibiotic that treats tuberculosis. TB used to be extremely deadly. Well, I mean, okay, it still is, but it used to be very common. And it is highly contagious, and it is a killer. However, thanks to these two items right in here, the vaccine for polio and this antibiotic, we have essentially wiped out these two diseases. Now, not completely, but we've gone real close. We've gotten real close to it. Civil rights movement. The 50s and the 60s saw a significant increase in the awareness of the plight of African Americans and other minorities, primarily African Americans, and attempted to right previous wrongs. And we've talked a great deal about this already, so I'm not going to go into any more depth than that, because again, we've covered it. I have other videos on that material that you can watch. Jackie Robinson, first African American baseball player to break the color line and play in Major League Baseball. And this was in 1947. It helps if I could write 1947. Yay, got that one. And then finally, litigation, resolving disputes in court. Going to court. Suing someone, being sued, is part of litigation. And this was a way that a number of civil rights issues were resolved through litigation, like the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Speaking of which, here's our next term. The Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. This case overturned the Plessy decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896. And here's Plessy right there. By the way, that 9 should be, there we go, parentheses, I'm sorry about that. Let me go back and correct that. Anyway, Brown overturned Plessy. Plessy created the concept of separate but equal. And again, If you've seen the other videos, you understand this. We've gone over this in great depth and detail. If you've not, then let me touch on this real quickly. 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court upheld the segregation of laws of several states. The Supreme Court upheld segregation laws allowing segregation in southern states, creating this concept of separate but equal. Separate public accommodations, hotels, motels, restaurants, bathrooms, water fountains, at that time railroad cars, and eventually buses, movie theaters, on and on and on. So it created, Plessy versus Ferguson created the concept of separate but equal, legalized segregation. Brown versus the Board of Education overturned Plessy and ruled that separate but equal, the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy was unconstitutional. Legalized segregation is unconstitutional. Sweat versus Painter, 1950. Herman Sweat sued the University of Texas Law School. Go fight, win, horns. Hook 'em. And the Supreme Court sided with Mr. Sweat. Mr. Sweat, yes. Sided with Mr. Sweat that the separately created law school at UT created a separate law school for African Americans. The Supreme Court ruled in Sweat versus Painter that the UT Law School created specifically for African Americans did not meet, and this is key, did not meet the concept of separate but equal. Now again, why is this still in place? Well, again, Sweat is 1950. Brown versus the Board of Education is 1954. So Sweat takes place prior to Brown. And by the way, the did not meet separate but equal, it's not because of the fact that it was a separate facility. It was because Mr. Sweat was isolated, and therefore his isolation did not rise to the standard separate but equal. Thurgood Marshall argued the Brown case before the Supreme Court. Eventually, of course, he is appointed to become the first African-American court justice. Earl Warren, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the Brown case, and he wrote the unanimous decision which overturned Plessy. Inherently, and this is one of the words that was used in Warren's decision, inherently means by its very nature. The valley has inherently hot temperatures. Why? Well, that's just what we are, okay? Our closeness to the equator means that we're going to have warmer temperatures than you would have in Minnesota. So inherently means by its very nature. I could go on and give you examples, but hopefully you're smart enough that you can figure it out. Now we go to some other terms. Again, we have covered these in other videos, but we're going to do this right now. Jim Crow, segregation laws found throughout the South. Prior to the Civil War, we had slave codes. Just after the Civil War, we had black codes, and they were ways in which the Southern Democrats could keep the slaves and then the newly freed slaves after the war under control. Jim Crow laws were laws that dealt with segregation, laws that prevented blacks from voting, and on and on and on. Jim Crow, segregation. Rosa Parks, African-American seamstress who refused to give up her bus seat to a white man, which was the law. And this is in Montgomery, Alabama. This led to a boycott of the buses in the city and eventually a change in the law. And as I told you, Miss Parks was not just some tired working class woman who refused to give up her seat. She was an NAACP activist. She had been involved for a number of years in voting and getting African Americans registered to vote, and on and on and on. Does that diminish anything that she did? No. Her actions led to the boycott of city buses because they were segregated, and this brought about a huge change in the policy, and eventually the segregated buses of Montgomery were done away with. The person who benefited a great deal from this was Martin Luther King. He was a pastor in Montgomery. He led the bus boycott, and he gained national attention due to this, and he became the leader of the civil rights movement in America. He became the heart and soul. He became the face of the civil rights movement in America. So Rosa Parks did this just as John Scopes did when we talked about the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes taught evolution in class. He knew it was illegal. It was done on the behalf of the ACLU because they wanted to challenge the law. Rosa Parks wanted to challenge the law, hoping that something like this would occur, which would lead to the change. And it did. Civil Rights Act, there are a number of them in the past, but this is the one in 1957. It was signed into law by Eisenhower, and the idea was to increase African American voting in the South. It created the Civil Rights Commission. It's a government office that oversaw that the federal courts were given the power to register African American voters. Now, it wasn't overly effective because the registration process was highly complicated and blah, blah, blah. Okay. But the idea is we are making steps. We are taking steps forward. We are making progress. Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Commission. We're now getting the federal courts involved to register African American voters. If left up to the devices of the states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Carolina, the Carolinas, then those African Americans are not going to be allowed to vote. Again, we're talking about the Deep South. We're talking about the Democratic-held Deep South, the people who had enslaved these African Americans, that had fought a war to keep them slaves, the Democrats who had created the KKK. Bull Connor, Lester Maddox, Orville Faubus, George Wallace were all Democrats, and they were all, at best, segregationists. At worst, they were racist. The Deep South was a Democrat stronghold. It was the home of racism in America. Now let's move forward. Orville Faubus, talked about him previously, governor of Arkansas who favored segregation. He ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the all-white Little Rock High School in order to keep black students out. 2 or 3 years earlier, the Little Rock ISD had decided to integrate their schools, and they were going to do it slowly. And they started with what is referred to as a Little Rock nine African-American students who were going to try to enter Little Rock High School. And this is when Faubus sent out the Arkansas National Guard to keep the black students out from this Little Rock High School. Eisenhower, president at the time, and again, this is in 57, Eisenhower ordered federal troops to Arkansas, to Little Rock, to ensure that the students were allowed in. So the Little Rock nine black students who attempted to enter a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, they were prohibited from doing so at first by Orville Faubus and the Arkansas National Guard. Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock to ensure that these 9 teenagers were allowed to go to high school. Status quo, to maintain the existing system, to keep things as they are. In the Deep South, that was segregation. What the Little Rock Nine, what the Civil Rights Acts represented, what the Montgomery bus boycott represented, what Rosa Parks represented, what Martin Luther King represented, was a change to the existing system, a change to the status quo. Lester Maddox gained national attention when he faced down African Americans, when he refused to allow African Americans into his restaurant, and supposedly he attacked one with an axe handle, not just the wooden part. How is he rewarded for his racism? Well, he becomes governor of Georgia. That is how the Georgians felt about race at that time. George Wallace, Governor of Alabama stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama, as you have seen if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump. He stood in the doorway as a symbolic attempt to sorry, got cut off there. Sorry, I got cut off there. So Wallace stands in the doorway of the University of Alabama as a symbol. All right, I've been cut off several times. Let's see if we can get this finished up. So in the movie Forrest Gump, we see George Wallace standing in the doorway as a symbol, attempting to keep black students from attending class. Okay, what we're going to do is go ahead and close this off right now. I've had a number of problems with the internet, plus we're about a little over 20 minutes. So what we're going to go ahead and do is stop it at this time. We'll come back with a fourth video, but this has been part 3 of our vocabulary terms from the Jarrett chapter 13. We're going to go ahead and end it at this time. We'll come back with part 4, which will be a short one. I only have about 3 or 4 more slides left, but like I said, I've had a lot of problems with the internet, so I'm going to stop it this time.